She walked in on her cold millionaire boss crying naked in the shower, holding a photo. Claire Monroe never expected to find her boss, Ethan Callahan, broken, naked, and unraveling in a place as intimate as a shower. Ethan was a man carved from stone. That's what everyone at Callahan Architects said first. Cold, brilliant, unforgiving. The kind of man who could freeze an entire boardroom with a single look and dismantle a multi-million-dollar project with one well-placed sentence. Claire had worked as his personal assistant for nearly a year, and in all that time, he had never once smiled at her. Not genuinely, not warmly, just the occasional curt nod, clipped commands, and long silences heavy with tension. She had learned how to move silently in his presence, how to vanish when needed, how to anticipate his needs before he spoke. Working for Ethan felt like walking barefoot over broken glass. There was no room for error, no room for softness. That night, everything changed. It was nearly midnight when Claire took the express elevator to Ethan's penthouse, carrying a last-minute design portfolio that needed his signature before dawn. He had left the office early, rare for him, but she, ever diligent, had volunteered to deliver it personally. The building was silent. The hallway stretched out, still and cold. Claire expected the same quiet behind the penthouse door, but the first thing she noticed was, it was ajar. Steam spilled out like smoke, thick and heavy, curling into the corridor light. Her first instinct was to leave, but then she heard it. Water running, constant and sharp, and nothing else. No voices, no music, no footsteps. She hesitated, Ethan's voice echoing in her head. No intrusions, no weakness. But something tugged at her, a thread of concern too persistent to ignore. She pushed the door open. The living room was pristine, as always. Clean lines, sharp edges, floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting Chicago's city lights onto polished marble. But it was the condensation on the walls that led her down the hallway to the master bathroom. "Ethan," she called gently, hand hovering over the doorknob. No response. Her heart pounded. She inhaled, then opened the door. The scene stole her breath. There he was, Ethan Callahan, the untouchable architect of empires, sitting on the tiled floor of the shower, water pouring over his head and shoulders. His arms were wrapped tightly around his chest, his body bare and exposed, as if every layer he'd ever built around himself had been peeled away. In his trembling hand, a small photograph, burnt at the corners, creased and faded. His head was bowed, face buried in one palm. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths, like he was drowning, not from the water, but from something buried deep inside. He was crying. Claire froze. Every instinct screamed for her to turn back, to pretend she hadn't seen this moment. But she couldn't move, couldn't look away from the man unraveling in front of her. And in that single, suspended breath, the crack didn't just form in him, it formed in her too. Claire didn't remember leaving the apartment, only that one moment she was standing in steam, and the next she was outside, breath fogging in the cold. Her legs had carried her out on their own, her body moving through the motions while her mind stayed trapped in the steam, in the sound of water hitting tile, in the image of a man holding himself like it was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. Ethan Callahan, the man everyone believed was unbreakable, the man she had never seen laugh, never seen soften, the man who orchestrated entire city skylines with surgical precision, who timed his words, his suits, his life with terrifying control. And last night he had cried, alone, in the dark, holding a torn photograph like it was the only piece of himself left intact. Claire hadn't slept. She tossed in bed, her mind replaying every detail of that moment in the bathroom. The water, the silence, the rawness. She arrived at the office earlier than usual, heart still racing. Ethan walked in at exactly 8:01 a.m., as he always did. Charcoal suit, crisp shirt, hair perfect, shoes shining. His expression gave nothing away. No trace of the man she'd seen shattered the night before. He passed her desk, gave a polite nod. "Today's schedule?" His voice was even, flat. "Business as usual." Claire nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled up the calendar. "I've rescheduled the budget review and moved your meeting with the design leads to 10. Good, he replied without looking at her. All morning they interacted like always. Polite, efficient, empty. But Claire felt it. Something had shifted. And while Ethan had rebuilt the wall around himself overnight, the cracks were still there. Barely visible, but real. He avoided her gaze, avoided any moment that might remind him of the night before. But Claire couldn't look away. She started noticing things she'd never paid attention to. The way his shoulders never fully relaxed, like he was constantly bracing for impact. The way his fingers tapped restlessly on his coffee cup when the room went quiet. The way his eyes sometimes drifted to the windows, not watching the city, but lost somewhere far beyond it. These weren't the patterns of a cold man. They were the symptoms of someone who had forgotten how to breathe without holding back. She began to wonder, what could possibly break a man like Ethan Callahan? A man who didn't just hide his emotions, but locked them away like they were dangerous? The answer wouldn't be simple, but Claire knew this much. It had to be something deep, something devastating. That evening, long after the others had gone home, Claire stayed behind, organizing the schedule for next week. The office had gone quiet, bathed in the soft glow of her desk lamp and the distant hum of the city outside. She looked up at the sound of footsteps. Ethan stood by the window, hands in his pockets, staring out at the skyline. He didn't speak. Neither did she. But in that heavy, aching silence, something became undeniable. Ethan Callahan wasn't made of stone. He was made of pain. Since that night, something unspoken lived between Claire and Ethan. A silence with weight, a nearness that existed without touch. They never mentioned the bathroom, never spoke of the photograph, never acknowledged the tears. But something had shifted. Claire found herself staying later, not out of obligation, but because it felt wrong to leave while Ethan remained, quietly seated in his glass office, staring out into the city like he was searching for something he'd lost. And sometimes, just sometimes, their eyes would meet through the blur of late-night lights. He wouldn't smile, but he wouldn't look away either. One night, she brought him a coffee upstairs to the upper-level lounge where he often worked after hours. She knocked gently, then stepped inside. He was standing by the glass railing, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, hands resting on the edge as he stared out over Chicago. "I thought you might need this," she said, holding the cup toward him. His gaze dropped to it, then to her. For a second, he hesitated. Then he reached out. Their fingers brushed, warm, unsure, trembling. "Thank you," he said quietly. His voice was different, softer. Not the voice of a boss. The voice of a man receiving something he didn't think he deserved. Claire nodded and turned to leave. But his voice stopped her, low and hesitant. "Claire," she turned. His eyes held hers, steady and searching. "Do you believe people can change?" She didn't answer right away. She walked slowly toward the door, paused. "I think we all want to," she said, "but wanting isn't always enough." He nodded slightly as if her answer confirmed something he'd been afraid to admit. That night she lay awake, not because of the question, but because of the way he'd looked at her when he asked it. It wasn't just a question, it was a confession hiding behind composure. After that, their conversations shifted. They spoke more often, about things that had nothing to do with work, about a book he used to love, a piano he once played badly in a cramped apartment during college, about nights when he walked the city alone just to forget who he was. One evening, as she was leaving, he called out softly, "I saw you that night," he said. She froze. "I know." He looked down at his hands, then back at her. "You shouldn't have had to see that." "Maybe not," she replied, "but I did, and I'm still here." He stared at her for a long time, like trying to understand why she hadn't walked away. But Claire had no explanation that made sense, and he didn't ask for one. Another day, she walked into his office to find him staring at something on his desk. As she approached, she recognized it. The same photo, burned at the corners, edges curled. He caught her glance and quickly flipped it over, but she had already seen it. "I never asked," she said gently. "But the person in that photo, they mattered, didn't they?" He didn't answer, but she saw it in the way his shoulders tensed, the way his hand gripped the edge of the desk. Between them, the space that once felt like a canyon now felt bridged. by silence, by understanding, by the quiet miracle of staying. They hadn't touched, hadn't loved. But Claire was beginning to understand. There are things bigger than love, like when someone lets you see them shattered, and you choose to stay. Though no promises had been spoken, no boundaries crossed, Claire knew something between them had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. The silences they shared no longer felt empty. They made room for truth to breathe. Ethan was no longer just the untouchable figure in the glass office. He became someone she saw in the quietest ways, in how he lingered by the windows too long, how his eyes always found hers when she entered, and in the questions he asked that had nothing to do with work. What did you like doing on rainy days as a kid? Do you listen to music while working? What did you dream of becoming before this? They weren't flirtations. They weren't polite curiosity. He simply wanted to know. At first, Claire answered cautiously, but then she realized Ethan wasn't testing her. He was listening. One late evening, while tidying the office, Claire noticed light still glowing under the door of Ethan's office. He had left earlier, or so she thought. But the soft light drew her toward it, not with words, but with instinct. She didn't knock. She stepped inside gently, like the room no longer needed permission. Claire hadn't meant to pry. She was simply looking for the updated design report Ethan had requested at the last minute. But as she stepped into his office late in the afternoon, her eyes were drawn to the bookshelf behind his desk. One book sat askew, its spine cracked, cover faded. Someone had read it recently. Curious, Claire reached for it. As she pulled the book free, a photograph slipped out and fluttered to the floor. She bent down and picked it up. It was the same photo, creased and burned, that she'd seen in Ethan's hands that night in the shower. This time she looked closely. 3 people stood together. A teenage Ethan, maybe 17 or 18, barely grown into his features. A woman with dark hair, likely his mother. And a boy, roughly the same age as Ethan, but with a softer gaze and a hesitant smile. He looked almost exactly like Ethan. Twins. Claire's heart slowed. A chill ran through her. Behind her, the door opened. Ethan entered. When he saw the photograph in her hand, he froze. They didn't speak for a long moment. Claire didn't apologize. She didn't hide the photo. She looked up at him and gave him space, to run or to stay. He didn't run. He walked to his desk, sat down, and exhaled like the weight had finally become too heavy. Leo, he said quietly. His name was Leo. Claire sat across from him, the photo still resting in her palm. I've never told anyone about him, Ethan continued. Not because I didn't want to, I just didn't know how to say it without breaking again. His voice trembled, but he didn't stop. It was the sound of someone who had been silent too long. Leo was my twin. He was different, Ethan said, eyes fixed on the photo. He didn't communicate like most people, avoided eye contact, but he was brilliant in ways no one understood. He could decode patterns, build robots, sketch architectural models I still don't fully grasp. Claire stayed quiet, letting every word land like pieces of a puzzle she had waited months to see. But the world didn't make room for boys like Leo, he said, voice tightening. School wanted him to blend in. Our family wanted him to be normal. They didn't try to understand him. They didn't want to. He clenched his fist. I was the only one who could reach him, the only one who knew how to calm him when he spiraled, who could understand what he was saying even when he said nothing. Claire felt a quiet ache open in her chest, the kind born of love and loss. I thought I could protect him, Ethan said. I promised him I wouldn't leave. But then one night, I did. I was 18, had just gotten into architecture school. I needed space. I left him. He paused. His throat worked against the weight of memory. There was a fire that night. No one knows how it started. But when I got back, he was gone. Claire swallowed hard. I should have been there, Ethan whispered. I was his brother, the only person he trusted, and I left him to die alone. Silence wrapped around them. The ticking of the clock became the only sound between them. Claire reached out, placed her hand gently over his. You were everything to him, she said softly. And now, whether you see it or not, you still carry him. In every space you design, in every choice you make. Ethan didn't respond, but the shine in his eyes said more than words ever could. Ethan had always told stories behind armor, rigid, rehearsed, as if he were reciting lines from a script designed to keep emotions at bay. But this time, when he spoke of Leo, his voice broke in pieces. There was no pretense, no rage, just raw, unfiltered grief. She didn't try to fix him. She didn't try to fill the silence. She just sat there, her hand resting gently on his, not gripping, not letting go. Steady, present, unshaken. And to Ethan, that was more disarming than anything else. Because in his life, when he'd shared anything close to vulnerable, people usually reacted in three ways. They tried to fix it, flee from it, or pretend it wasn't there. But Claire did none of those things. She listened. She accepted the story without revision, held space for the pain without needing to name it, and stayed, something he had never dared expect. Ethan turned slightly, his gaze finding hers like he was seeing a person clearly for the first time. Not through glass, not through caution, but through truth. "No one's ever listened to me like that," he said quietly, as though louder words might break the moment. Claire looked at him. "That's because they never really saw you." He closed his eyes, not to hide tears, but to breathe. Really breathe. After a pause, he spoke again. "I always thought if I told someone, they'd see me as a failure, as a brother who left, a selfish kid who let someone die." Claire shook her head gently. "No, Ethan. A selfish person wouldn't carry that photo for years. A cold heart doesn't break over a name." His hand tensed, not in resistance, but because her words had touched something deep, something he hadn't dared reach for himself. "He used to draw these designs," Ethan whispered. "Concepts, ideas of cities where kids like him didn't have to change to fit in." Claire swallowed hard. "And now you're building them." For the first time, Ethan didn't flinch, didn't retreat. He nodded, slowly, heavily, as if finally acknowledging the truth he'd never let himself believe, that he wasn't just surviving. He was continuing a dream that was never meant to die. After that conversation, nothing between Claire and Ethan was formally said, and yet everything had changed. Ethan wasn't closed off anymore, and Claire no longer felt like she was walking a tightrope. Their interactions carried a new ease, not avoidance, but quiet presence, as if, without words, they had both chosen to step into a space that hadn't existed before, a space where vulnerability could breathe. Ethan began sharing small things about Leo. He used to line up his pencils by color before doing homework, he mentioned one afternoon as they reviewed blueprints. He hated loud sounds, but loved thunder. Said it felt like the universe was talking. Claire smiled and tucked each memory away like precious artifacts. Every story felt like she was being let inside a soul Ethan had kept sealed for years. One evening, as she gathered her things to leave, Ethan called out to her. He stood by his desk, holding a worn notebook with frayed edges and a cracked leather cover. "This was his," he said, offering it to her. Claire opened it. Inside were pencil sketches, rough but imaginative. Robots, spiraling towers, bridges connecting floating cities. Tiny handwritten notes lined the margins. The handwriting slightly slanted, uneven. "Leo's dreams," Ethan said. "He wanted to build machines that could think like people, but kinder." Claire ran her fingers over the drawings. Her chest ached, not with pity, but with the vibrancy still alive on the page. She looked up. "And now you are," she said quietly, "in your own way." Ethan gave a small, rare smile, crooked and tinged with something softer than regret. "Maybe I built Callahan Architects for him," he murmured, "even if I didn't know it then." She didn't respond with words. She just placed her hand over the notebook, then met his eyes as if to say, "I see that. I see you." After that night, everything between them slowed down, deepened. Ethan started bringing Claire coffee in the mornings. He never explained, just left it on her desk and walked away. He began asking, "Did you get home okay?" whenever it rained. And sometimes when they passed each other in the hallway, their hands brushed, just briefly. Long enough to feel, not long enough to label. Each moment was small, but to Claire it felt like someone was building a bridge, slowly, carefully, honestly, from the other side of a canyon she'd once thought she could never cross. They never said the word us. There were no labels, no definitions. But every moment between them carried something deeper than words. Claire had grown used to Ethan's presence orbiting her day, not as a boss, not quite as a lover, just someone she always noticed, someone whose silence she understood, someone who made her feel seen, even when no one was watching. And Ethan, though he never said it aloud, had begun to drift toward her like she was the only stillness in a world he once controlled through logic and fear. There was something about her that quieted him, but the most delicate things are often the ones most easily shaken. Intimacy without a name is just as vulnerable to misinterpretation, and walls once cracked can rebuild faster than the courage it takes to admit they ever fell. Their peace didn't last long. On a quiet Monday morning, just as Claire set her coffee down on her desk, the elevator doors opened, and the woman who stepped out, heels sharp, coat immaculate, smile honed like a blade, was the first sign of a storm neither of them were ready for. Her name was Vanessa Blake. Perfectly tailored dress, confident stride, eyes that made you feel like she already knew your secrets. Vanessa didn't need an introduction. Her presence alone was a statement. Claire saw the change in the room the moment Vanessa stepped out of the elevator. The air shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Even the fluorescent light seemed to flicker. Vanessa smiled, polite, practiced, and cold enough to make people hesitate before returning it. Ethan didn't mention he had such a charming assistant, Vanessa said as she shook Claire's hand, her gaze more assessing than greeting. Claire offered a measured smile. Claire Monroe. She didn't ask who Vanessa was. She didn't need to. Whispers followed soon after. Vanessa had once been a strategic consultant during Callahan Architects' European expansion. She and Ethan had been more than colleagues, and whatever had ended between them, it hadn't ended clean. Claire kept working, scheduling meetings, updating reports. But something uneasy started curling inside her chest. A slow, quiet unraveling. Vanessa began appearing more often. Meetings, project reviews, strategy sessions. She had a reason to be there. International partnerships, new markets, big contracts. But Claire knew better. Vanessa wasn't just here for business. She was here to be seen. Ethan never mentioned her presence, never explained, never gave any indication that things between him and Claire had changed, and somehow that silence felt worse than anything. One evening, as Claire was leaving late, the elevator doors were just about to close when Vanessa stepped in. Just the two of them, quiet, still, no greeting, no words. Until Vanessa tilted her head slightly, voice soft as silk. I tried to fix him once, thought I could seal the cracks. But Ethan doesn't heal. He adapts, like code. Claire turned to her, face calm. Maybe he just needed the right environment. Vanessa gave a slow, deliberate smile. Or maybe you're just the silence he needs, before the storm catches him again. The elevator stopped. Vanessa stepped out without looking back. Claire didn't move for a moment. That night, she didn't sleep. After Vanessa's return, Ethan began to slip back into the man Claire had known in the beginning. Quiet, precise, unreachable. He still arrived on time. Still said thank you when she handed him documents. Still nodded when she updated his schedule. But now it all felt like theater. And Claire knew the audience wasn't her. It was him. His silence wasn't confusion. It was choice. A decision not to be seen. Not to let anyone step closer. Claire tried. Once, then again. A smile here. A glance there. Moments where he could have spoken, but didn't. One evening, long after the office had emptied, Claire stood outside his office door, heart full of a weight she could no longer carry. She didn't want to retreat, but she also couldn't keep walking blind. She knocked once, then walked in without waiting. Ethan looked up from his papers, momentarily surprised, then masked it with that familiar calm. Is something wrong? He asked, voice even, as if nothing had ever passed between them beyond job titles. Claire walked straight in, no folders, no excuses. Just one question, heavy and simple, the kind that changes things. What am I to you, Ethan? He froze, didn't answer. Claire didn't back down. She looked at him, not with anger, not with accusation, but with quiet clarity. She needed to know, was she real in his world or just a place he stopped to breathe? Ethan looked away, his hands tensed on the edge of the desk. No answer, no words, not even a sigh. Silence, again. Claire felt the chill settle between them, a small crack that had widened into something irreversible. She nodded, just once, as if accepting that sometimes no answer is the only answer. She turned, walked out, and for the first time, the door behind her stayed closed. Claire couldn't remember how she got home that night, only the chill in her fingers, the hollow ache in her chest, like losing something she had never quite held. Ethan didn't follow. He didn't call. And somehow that was the part that hurt the most. In the days that followed, Claire worked from home, not because she had to, but because she simply couldn't walk back into a place where she had once hoped for so much. Ethan didn't reach out. No messages, no questions. Only silence stretched between them, wide enough to feel permanent. Until one afternoon, as she was closing her laptop, the building manager knocked gently at her door. He handed her a plain envelope. No name, no return address, just a single line written in faded ink. Ethan Callahan, don't open too soon. She hesitated, but something in her fingers moved on instinct. Claire opened the envelope slowly, and inside was an old piece of paper, yellowed at the edges, the handwriting messy and smudged. It wasn't from Ethan. It was from Leo. The letter was short, just one page. Messy handwriting, some words smudged, as if it had been written quickly or by impatient hands. Maybe the hands of a young boy. Claire sat in silence, reading each line slowly, her eyes pausing longer on the misspellings and ink blots, like she was trying to hear the whisper of a ghost. I'm sorry I broke your robot. I just wanted to see how it worked. Please don't be mad. You're the best. I love you more than computers. Leo. Claire lowered the letter, her heart heavy. She hadn't known much about Leo, just scattered fragments Ethan had allowed to surface. Brilliant, different, misunderstood by everyone except Ethan. And now through this small letter, she saw something clearer. Love, trust, and the origin of a guilt Ethan had carried like a sentence for 2 decades. She imagined little Leo, awkward, curious, breaking his brother's toy, but still brave enough to write an apology in shaky handwriting. And she imagined Ethan, calculated, composed, unreadable, sitting alone with this letter in his hand, never showing it to anyone, until now. His pain wasn't just memory. It was present. It shaped every distance he created. It was why he couldn't love softly, why silence had always been his shield. Claire didn't know how the letter had found its way to her. Maybe Ethan had left it, or maybe someone in his family had finally let go. But whatever its origin, she understood. This letter wasn't written for her. It was written for Ethan, by a part of him that had never truly been forgiven. She folded the paper carefully, slid it into her coat pocket, and for the first time in days stepped outside without hesitation. She didn't call, didn't warn, she just went. The therapy center sat quietly on a side street near the park, tucked behind rows of chestnut trees just starting to bloom. The wooden sign read Autism Learning Garden, the letters weathered and fading, as if the place had never asked for attention. Claire stood at the gate, the folded letter still in her pocket. She wasn't entirely sure what had brought her here. Instinct, maybe, or her heart. But she knew Ethan was inside. She stepped in. No noise, no formality. Just calm, gentle laughter. The soft clack of wooden blocks being stacked and knocked down again. She spotted him almost immediately, sitting on a bench near the back garden, leaning forward, elbows on knees, eyes following a young boy building a tower, only to topple it again and again. Ethan didn't look up. But when Claire stepped closer, he lifted his head. His eyes weren't guarded, weren't surprised, just tired in the most honest way. She sat beside him, saying nothing. A minute passed. Then he spoke, voice low. Leo used to do that, repeat things no one else understood. But to him, it was how he made sense of the world. Claire didn't reply. She waited. Ethan exhaled, still watching the boy. I spent my whole life trying to carry everything. Be strong, be in control, be the one who never broke, because no one else could afford to. His voice cracked. But then Leo died, and I still couldn't save him. So I became cold, calculated, because I didn't want anyone to see me falling apart. Claire whispered, "You don't have to stay that way." He turned to her, something fragile in his expression. "Claire, I don't know how to love someone without hurting them. I'm afraid if I let anyone too close, they'll see me. Not the CEO, not the success, but the boy who left home when his brother needed him most." She shook her head softly. "I don't need an apology, Ethan." He frowned. "I need the truth." Silence. Only the wind in the trees and the rhythmic laughter of a boy in the distance. Ethan lowered his gaze. This time he didn't hide. "You're the first thing that's made me want to be human again." Claire reached out, her hand finding his slowly, without pressure. "Then stop running. Let me see you. Even the parts you hate." Ethan stared at their joined hands. He didn't say "I love you." He didn't promise forever. He just nodded softly, as if, for the first time, he had no intention of stepping away again. Time didn't rush. Ethan didn't change in a day, a week, or even a month. But he changed bit by bit, like spring melting ice without a sound. With Claire, he began building something that once only lived in memory. The Leo Education Center, a school for children like his brother. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't penance. It was a way to rewrite Leo's story, with a different ending. One where misunderstood children were heard, loved, and allowed to dream. Ethan no longer avoided the past. Instead, he learned to live beside it. He spoke more about Leo, about the repeated phrases, the messy robot sketches, the clumsy hugs and eyes full of unconditional trust. Claire stood by him, not as an assistant, not needing a title. She was his anchor, the quiet hand that held his when memories shook him to his core. He didn't try to erase the past anymore. Didn't force himself to be strong enough to feel nothing. He had learned to live with the pain, without letting it consume him. And in doing so, he began to live differently. Present, real, unguarded. 1 year later, the bathroom hadn't changed, but the man inside was no longer drowning in memories. He was cradling the future. Warm water fell gently onto his shoulders. Ethan stood silently beneath the shower, holding his newborn daughter in his arms. She slept soundly against his bare chest, tiny hands clinging to his soaked shirt, her breath soft as music. Claire stood in the doorway, her hand resting lightly against the wall, watching him, not as the assistant she once was. She was family now. Home, the present, and the future. Ethan turned toward her. He didn't speak, but in his eyes something lived that had never been there before. Peace. "Do you remember the first time I saw you in here?" Claire whispered. He nodded. "That day, I thought I'd lost everything," he said softly. She stepped closer, pressing a kiss to his shoulder where the water still ran. "And now?" He looked down at the tiny life asleep against him, and when he looked up, his eyes shimmered. "Now I know. I've been found.